Good morning and welcome to all of you. It's really great to welcome so many of you, and especially to welcome Paul Adams to talk with us about the topic of grief. As you may have read in the announcement of this day, in the poster for this event, Paul is the co-chair of the Canadian Grief Alliance, and he brings to this work a tremendous and an impressive career as a professor of journalism here in Ottawa, a broadcaster and a writer. And he brings personal experience, which we will turn to in just a moment. But first, I want to just remind you about Compassionate Ottawa. We're a community organization. We have a mission of building everyone's capacity to care for each other, especially in times of serious illness, of death and loss, and during grief, and while caregiving. And we focus on that purpose of encouraging and building capacity because we actually believe that everyone has a responsibility to care for others. And sometimes it's not all that easy to do that, to offer help or to ask for help. We do our work mostly through workshops and through conversations. We support research. We partner with a number of organizations on particular projects, and we create new resources. And one of the areas that we focus on is grief. So let's turn to that. And perhaps Paul can come on the screen now and I can begin the conversation with him. Hello,
Hi.
Paul, again. So great to have you with us this morning. Paul, you and I have run into each other at a few conferences and sessions on grief. And it has struck me that that topic seems to be of so much interest these days, even though talking about death, end of life, palliative care, grief is still somewhat taboo, still somewhat uncomfortable for lots of people. So there are lots of themes like that that I'd like to explore with you. Like, why is there so much talk right now? And how is grief, end of life grief, experienced by different people, by children, for example, or by people who are lonely and isolated and have no one else with whom they can interact about the sorrow that they're feeling, or marginalized people who are also very isolated and who often die alone and others don't even know that they have died or don't know the circumstances. So I hope we're going to have some time to look at some of those questions, and some of them may have come up in the survey that I know you're going to describe to us. But I really want to get started by asking you to describe your own personal journey, that and your family, into the world of palliative care and death of a very much loved member of your family. So let me turn that over to you to begin that.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this today. As an Ottawan myself, I'm actually in Toronto today at a friend's home, but as somebody who lives in Ottawa, of course, I've known about Compassionate Ottawa, and I in the course of my work at the Canadian Grief Alliance the last year or two, I've been talking to people across the country about grief resources and what's being done about grief, and also more generally about palliative care. And I would say that what I didn't realize was how lucky we were in Ottawa to have Compassionate Ottawa. Like, I think a lot of communities would love to have an organization like yours and deserve it. And I hope that I know you're missionary for the concept of compassionate communities, and so I hope that over time that's something that does develop and spread across the country. So just to my personal, or our personal experience, my wife Suzanne died 8 years ago from the complications of breast cancer. Suzanne was a Canadian diplomat. She spoke 3 languages fluently, spoke several others less fluently, but ably in conversation. She was like a devoted public servant, I would say, and she was very loving mother and devoted to our two children, Sophia and Alex. When we were actually posted, she was posted in New Zealand. We were living there when she was diagnosed. At that time, our daughter Sophia was 10 years old, and our son Alex was 14 years old. Suzanne died 4 years later, so they were um, uh, 14 and 18 at that point. They were Sophia was in her very first month of high school when Suzanne died. Alex was in his very first month of university when she died. And I mention that because um, in terms of grief, adolescence, of course, is you don't have to lose your mother to have a difficult time in those years. Those are tough years as you come out of childhood and into adulthood, and there's lots of complications and pressures. And in addition to be living under the shadow of your mother's illness and eventual death, it's a huge thing. And I don't think that we're really fully prepared for that, to support people who are in that situation as a family. Um, just on the topic of grief, I mean, I could go many different directions, but let me just say as a premise that it was because I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it was because Suzanne did not get the palliative care and the end of life counseling that I think that she deserved, that I became active in supporting palliative care. After she died, I felt like, as a kind of gesture of love towards her, that what I should do is try to make it better for people in the future than the kind of care that she had had. And it was sort of from that experience in writing about palliative care initially, and then volunteering in various organizations, that I got drawn in at the beginning of the pandemic. We formed the Canadian Grief Alliance because we thought there's going to be a pandemic of grief that comes along with that pandemic of COVID, which indeed I think turned out to be true. And I think it's a partial answer to your question why there's so much attention on grief right now. But let me just go back to our sort of personal story. What I would say was that Suzanne, as an oncology patient, and I attended virtually all of her medical meetings. When you go into that meeting with the physician, the attention of the physician is really on the patient, or I would say even it's on a part of the patient's body. It's not even fully attentive always to the patient as a fully realized person. It's like the patient is walking in with these diseased organs, which are the point of interest to the doctors to some extent. As the spouse, as a family caregiver, well, I was there, but really no attention was paid to me by the physicians, the nurses, or like in any sense of, oh, he must be dealing with grief as well as the caregiving responsibilities. But at least I was sort of in the room hearing all this. Our children were not, they were not acknowledged as part of kind of this circle of care that the system embraced. And yet, when you think of it, somebody should have known that there were some kids back home who were hurting, right? So I would say, first of all, I don't think that I think that the system paid some attention to Suzanne's grief about losing her life. The psychosocial care directed her to a psychiatrist that was very supportive of her, and that doesn't, that of course you can't there's no resolution of grief in that sense. And the old idea that you come to some kind of acceptance isn't necessarily true. But at least there was some attention given in a formal way to her situation. Uh, I would say there was very little of that for the three of the rest of us who were most immediately affected. Um, our son Alex had a kind of, I would say, a crippling anticipatory grief. He was very close to his mom. He fully understood what was happening, especially in the last year before she died. He was just overcome with grief over um, the prospect of his mother dying. He was in grade 12. He had already, by Christmas, he had earned a scholarship to Carleton. He seemed to be smoothly on his way into his university education. And then in the second half of grade 12, he just collapsed. He could barely get to school. He couldn't, and this is a student, he was like getting 99s in algebra and advanced functions. Like he was a very, very capable. Well, I won't talk about his English grades, but he was getting good grades in some subjects, and he just, like, all of that seemed to disappear. Among other things, I thought, like, is he going will he even be eligible for university, much less for a scholarship? And he there was no kind of formal support. He was lucky that there was a guidance counselor at his high school at Lisgers. The people in Ottawa would know that a woman named Leela Myers, and she was. I don't think she had any training in grief. And you know what? A guidance counselor, their main job is switching people's courses and helping them get to university and so on. It's not actually to deal with a kid who's cratering because of what's happening in his life and at home. And but she was a sympathetic person, and she was able to um, keep fashioning and refashioning things to sort of help him get through that term. And he did get through and graduate, but then he got to Carleton in the fall, where I was a professor at the time, and I thought I could help him navigate the best advice he could get, because Suzanne died on the 27th of September. So what's that, 2.5 weeks into term? The best advice that Carleton could give me was that he should go to each of his professors and explain his situation to get individual accommodations. Now imagine you're 18 years old, you've just started university, you're in that sort of bewildering what's going on, and you're supposed to go up to 5 adults whom you've never met in classes where there may be 100 or 200 other students, and you're supposed to say, my mom died last week, can I have an extension on the midterm paper or whatever, right? And you're supposed to do that 5 times. Like, that's a preposterous proposition. Like, and meanwhile, I would say my daughter, um, um, she had been in grade 8. She had been in the Catholic system where they basically ignored the fact that her mother was dying. She ended up at Lisgar in grade 9. So she was in her first month of grade 9, as I said. And I've subsequently learned that this is a common thing. She didn't want anyone to know. She didn't want any of her, she didn't want any of her peers, her schoolmates, to know that her mother was dying, or even that afterwards that her mother had died. And yet she was, like Alex had been, if she was in the guidance counselor's office, waiting outside in the waiting room while other students who had appointments had their course schedules adjusted, which of course at the end of September is like what the guidance counselor is doing. And I would say in my own case, I and I actually could recount a conversation where Suzanne, about a month or a month and a half before she died, said, like, "How are you doing?" And I said, "I don't know. I, I, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but I was so engaged with looking after her. She was in her last weeks, looking after this boy who was sort of falling out of his life, anxious for Sophia. I wasn't in touch with my own um, grief. And indeed, I don't think I was for many, many months. And I think this is something that happens with a lot of caregivers, that they are so absorbed in the logistics, the physical dimensions, the supportive dimensions, that they aren't really attending to their own um, grief. Um, so maybe I'll leave it there. I know that other things occurred to me as I was talking about this, but maybe you have some thoughts or some questions.
Well, I thank you, Paul, for that, for your story. And I know many people have sent you very best wishes and sympathy even today, because as you said earlier, grief doesn't suddenly go away and things don't suddenly return to normal. But I'm curious, just very briefly, how are your children today?
Well, so here's something I would say about um, my own sort of state of mind when Suzanne died, which was that, like, 14 and 18, I had, you know, drugs, alcohol, pregnancy, like I had every sort of nightmare in my mind. Like, I had heard of young people who sort of, I don't want to say went off the rails, but who struggled deeply, and they did struggle deeply. But um, I would say um, that they have struggled through it, and they're two successful young adults, that they continue to grieve their mother. It's been 8 years, but a week does not pass where one of them doesn't say to me something about their mom, or sort of say, wish you were here, or I miss mom, or something like that. It's still part of their lives. But I guess the phrase I often use is that they resume the trajectory of their lives, that they got things back enough together I would say, over the first year or two, to gradually get back on the track that they otherwise would have been on. And you uh, you never get over losing your mother, I don't think, not at that age. But I think in some ways it's made them stronger and deeper than. And actually, I would say that that's actually can be an issue also for teenagers, that they have had this very dramatic life event, and they it may seem like the people they know are concerned about having pimples or not making the volleyball team or whatever, and that all seems kind of small compared with what they're dealing with, and that can create sort of a gulf with friends. But they're doing well, and I'm very
Good.
proud of them, and we're
I can't help but comment at this point, Paul, and then I do have a couple of other thoughts. When Compassionate Ottawa became Compassionate Ottawa 6, 7, 8 years ago, we actually had a program in schools, in
right,
French language schools, quite a well-developed and well-accepted program. And of course, like everything during COVID, it disappeared.
right,
Schools have been, struggling may be too strong a word, but it's been hard to come back to whatever normal is. And so we haven't had that program. But
right.
boy, have you ever inspired me to think about what can an organization like Compassionate Ottawa do? What role could we play
Right.
in supporting schools to be thoughtful about
Right.
their students who are facing what your two students faced? So in a
Right.
sense, I want to say you've inspired us, but I know that you and your family paid a huge price for that. So just to go back to Suzanne and her care for a moment, I'm curious, was there any follow-up with her care team after her death, or did you initiate any, or what was that like for you, as you personally and you as a family? Because you were then in the midst of very profound grief after her death.
I wouldn't say that there was any follow-up. I did sometime later, maybe 6 months or a year later, send notes to her radiation oncologist and her medical oncologist. I initiated them, and they were,
Right.
we had a brief exchange. I was actually invited by the hospice, Briere, where she died, to be interviewed at some point by a graduate student who was doing research, and she about our experience, and she said, well, she asked me about follow-up, and I said, well, I'm not aware that there was any follow-up from the hospice. And she said, well, you would have received a survey. And like, I may or may not have received a survey, but I mean, that's like, okay, you buy a T-shirt from LL Bean, they'll send you a thing saying, how
Well,
did
and
we do? But that's not follow up in any meaningful sense, I don't think. So,
you know, yeah,
so I want to be careful, because I understand that, um, oncologists are very busy people. Hospices, like other institutions, have limited resources, and they need to sort of I've recently learned something that I hadn't known, which was in the United States, under the federal law that funds hospices, they are required to allocate a certain percentage of their budgets for grief counseling and grief care, so that there's kind of a structure there that says, okay, you need, and I'm not sure what the percentage
right,
is or how much
right,
it is,
right.
but there's nothing comparable that I'm aware of in Canada, and to be perfectly frank, when somebody dies, their billing number disappears, right? Like the professionals who are engaged in their lives and their treatment are no longer, like like nobody's paying them to look after you, right? And so I would say that people are now, to be clear, I mean, and I want to make clear that I'm not an expert, except that I've spent the last 2 years talking to experts and reading about this. But it, I think there's kind of a consensus in uh, places like Australia and Ireland and the UK, where they paid more attention to grief than we have here in an institutional sense. There's a consensus that, if you look at all the people who've lost someone close to them, or I should say, who have lost something close to them, because some people suffer tremendous grief from things that aren't death related, right?
Yes,
Like if you lose a limb, if your spouse is afflicted with Alzheimer's, these things create grief, and they're not necessarily um, death related in the first.
right,
But the research, as I understand it, which is not Canadian so much, it's more elsewhere, is that the most of us get through grief with the help of family and friends. And we can come back to this a little bit, because we're not getting the kind of help that we really want or need, but that's, like, most of us get through it that way. So there's a smaller percentage that need more formal care. Maybe they need some counseling, maybe a group uh, would work for them or something like that. And then there's maybe 8 or 10% who develop an actual mental health disorder that's in the, that psychiatrists recognize and so on.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of these layers, and they can, in part they have, like, grief can come into somebody's life who's stable and has a good job and is otherwise emotionally settled or in a good place. It also comes into people's lives who are jobless, who maybe have had another life event, who may not who may be precariously housed, who may have issues of abuse or substance use and so on. So that it doesn't just happen to grief doesn't just happen to people who have perfect lives, right?
Well, and I just to pick up on one point you made, and then I think that can take us into your work with the Canadian Grief Alliance. But just yesterday or earlier this week, I read an article, don't remember the source of it right now, which actually talked about how the rise in loneliness and
Right.
isolation is affecting grief. More
Right.
and more people are talking about how lonely they are. So
Right.
what does that mean? So absolutely, all those circumstances that you have described have a very significant impact. So let's
Right.
just rewind for just a moment, because I think your own personal experience led you to, I believe, being part of founding the Canadian Grief
Right.
Alliance. Today, you are the co-chair.
Right.
It would be great to hear just a little bit about the Alliance and what the work is.
Sure.
But I do know that the Alliance has conducted a survey, I
Right.
believe.
Right.
And that's what I'd really like to hear about from you. What was that survey? Who responded, and what did you learn from that? What are the key findings? And
Right.
it may not be over yet. You may still be in the midst of it. So whatever you can tell us to date would be useful.
Okay, so first of all, about the Grief Alliance, essentially what happened is, I alluded to this before. The start of the pandemic, we're sort of looking and going, there's no policy, there's no, there are people out there doing grief work, but we don't really, we have there's a makings of a plan to deal with those people coming into the emergencies and going on ventilators and so on, but there's no real plan for dealing with those people who are saying goodbye to their loved ones on iPads or waving to their grandmothers through the windows of care homes. There's really no plan for dealing with that, and so we formed because we felt like there should be a plan, there should be resources, there should be um, public policy towards this set of issues in a way that there is in some other countries, but there hasn't been here. So we didn't get that kind of overarching plan or policy that we had hoped for, but we got a grant from Health Canada to do a number of things that as an organization, that including we do monthly webinars on grief, and like people who are on can check those out, and we'll put a link, I think, in the next
And we
day.
promote those.
Right. Okay. So, and that we're building a website that's going to have resources for people who are grieving, that's going to go live fairly soon, I hope. But among the things we've done is we've done a major consultation with organizations that are with experts and so on, and we did this big survey that you're alluding to. So this was last December. I think initiated the survey. I was hoping we'd get 1,000 respondents. We got 4,000 respondents, which is I worked for a brief period in the polling industry, so that's a big number. And I think even that number is indicative of how people want to talk about their grief. They want an outlet to share something about, because grief is for many people extremely isolating. Grief for many people, I sometimes say that there's when you've now there's kind of disenfranchised grief, right? Like there are people, like if you lose a pregnancy, for example, there's no funeral, there's no ritual, there's no, people don't even necessarily talk to you about it. But if there are those things for, you do have a funeral when somebody dies, you do have rituals around the loss of somebody, which can be part of helping you to process your grief. But it very soon, this is something that we hear from a lot of people, it very soon happens that those supports fall away and people start feeling very isolated. The one kind of socially ratified, socially endorsed reaction to profound loss is sadness. You're allowed to be sad up to a point, and then I think people think, well, you should, get on your back on your horse and ride. But actually, grief can, for some people, be way more complicated than sadness. People may feel angry. They may be angry at the care, or angry at the person with whom they had complicated relationship and unresolved issues. They may feel lonely. They may feel uh, uh, their memory may not work as sharply. They may feel like kind of a brain fog. They may have physical issues. Their digestion may be affected. Their sleep may be affected. Like, grief is a much more complicated thing, and a lot of people, because we don't talk about it, they go like, is this normal? Is this, like, they're asking themselves, am I going nuts or whatever? I recently read a study that something like half of people who are grieving hear the voice of the person they lost, feel their touch, have some other kind of sensory experience. You might think you were going nuts if you didn't know that half of people have something like that. You might think, well, this isn't what I was told grief was supposed to be like. So it's very, very isolating. So to the survey, so some of what we found in the survey reflects what I've said already. Actually, most people, more than 90%, and these were people who were self-described as grieving, right? Most people said that they got support from family and friends. So more than 90%, more than 9 out of 10. But only about half said that they got the support that they needed, or that they felt that their grief was understood. So in other words, people are getting support, but it's not fully recognizing their grief. It doesn't fully speak to them. They feel isolated, even as they acknowledge that they're receiving this support. Another big finding out of this was that more than 90% said they wanted to be asked about their loss. They wanted to be asked about their grief. And when I looked at that, I thought, like, I look at my own life and behavior, and how many times have I known that somebody had had a profound loss and thought, oh, I don't want to upset them by bringing it up. Guess what? If you've lost your wife or your child or your parent, it's not going to be, somebody's not going to remind you, and you go, oh my God, now I feel bad because you just reminded me that I've lost my, somebody who's close to me. But the something that came through is that a lot of us have ways of even interacting with the grieving that shut out conversation instead of inviting it. So we say, oh, well, he had a good life, or everything happens for a reason. It's God's plan. These things, a lot of people told us these kinds of responses infuriate them. What many people say is, what I want is for people to ask me. Somebody said in our survey, ask me how he lived, not how he died. They want to talk about the person they lost, or they want to talk about their feelings, but they need to feel in control of like when and in what circumstance they talk about their feelings. So we need to develop a kind of vocabulary um, to support others. Like we need to understand our own grief better. Like there needs to be greater grief literacy, so that when we're struck by one of these terrible life events, that we have a better understanding of what we're going to go through and how we can deal with it. But we also need to be um, uh, to understand grief better, so that we can support each other, so that when someone I know is grieving, I'm not saying the wrong thing and doing the wrong thing, and I'm standing up instead of standing back, that I'm inviting conversation, that I'm allowing conversation, that I'm not finding ways of shutting it out. And so this is a big problem. Another thing that came through in our in our survey was that a lot of the formal supports, and I'm talking about spiritual leaders like rabbis, priests, um, um, uh, other spiritual leaders, family physicians, um, uh, even group, uh, like even bereavement groups or whatever. A lot of the things that are in place to support people who are grieving, there's a big chunk of the community who don't find them helpful. There's a bit like more than half the people we talked to said that their family physician was not helpful. That this is a place to which they turned, a person to whom they turned, and they weren't getting support. Hospice groups did much better. Um, uh, uh, Something that was very striking in the survey is that men are not doing well and don't. I'm talking like as a group, because not all men are the same, and not all women are the same. But for example, when you take the family physician, more than half of women thought that the family physician was helpful. Less than 20% of men thought the family physician was helpful. Men were much less likely to say that groups were helpful to them. And I think that we need to be, there's an interesting thing that's going on that started in Australia, and they have it in the UK and Ireland to some extent, called men's sheds.
It's actually here.
Oh, yeah, well,
it does exist.
And I have met with one fellow who's involved with them in BC, but I when I mention them, people often don't know what I'm talking about.
Right. Well,
but sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, please describe it just a little bit so everyone.
So these, as I understand it, I never attended one, but these are places where men can go, and I would say, like and this is my language, not theirs, but the emphasis is more on community, on comradeship, and on doing and meaning, as opposed to introspection and talk. And when you think of it, most of our kind of formal supports for the grieving are really about like examining your own inner life and then sharing it with one other person or a bunch of other people. Now, it's not like no men are find that useful. I found some of that useful myself. I went to a grief counselor for a bit. I went to a bereavement group for 6 or 8 weeks, and I found those very helpful to me. And it's not like all women find it easy to talk or whatever, but I think that we have to think about the fact that people grieve differently, and getting somebody who is not sort of temperamentally or in the course of their lives, normally somebody who's either introspective or comfortable sharing, we may need to find other ways of supporting them, and that may mean having more things, not just for men, but also for women who are, like what I guess what I'm saying is we shouldn't be trying to squeeze all the grieving people into our clinical approaches, right? We should be sort of meeting people where they are. And for some people, it's more about reconstituting community, finding comradeship, doing stuff together. And in the course of doing that with other people, perhaps who have had some similar circumstance, there will be places for talk and conversation, but it's not like I always think of this one group I was in, which was actually a caregivers group, it was before Suzanne died. It wasn't a bereavement group, but there was this couple who came, and in the first session, we were each supposed to talk about our own situation, right? And this couple, their daughter was dying of cancer. When it came their turn to talk about their daughter's situation, this man was in such exquisite pain and discomfort. He was really not able to speak, and he never came again. His wife continued to come to the group. And I'm thinking to myself, it's not because he didn't need support that he didn't come again. It was because the form of the support was too painful for him as someone who wasn't comfortable expressing his suffering. So we need to find ways to speak to those people, right?
Let's turn to that. So I just want to tell you one very quick story, Paul, that I learned quite recently, and it goes back to one of the points that you made just a moment ago before your last comments, and that is two people who were at one of our workshops, and one of them, who had recently been widowed, said she was finding it very difficult. She had no one to go to the theater with anymore. That was her loneliness, right? That was the example of her loneliness that was used. And another person in the group, I think a complete stranger, said, "I'll go with you."
Right.
And so these two women who were on their own, living with grief,
right,
found each other and are accompanying each other to the theater. That doesn't happen very often.
Right.
But it's what we hope happens in community. So I'd like to turn to, I have to say that so much of what you said, I personally can relate to. I, like everybody on this call, have experienced the death of parents, of a spouse. Not everybody's experienced that, of siblings. So I know what you're talking about, and I can't see people on the screen, but I can feel people are nodding their heads. We can relate to what you're saying, much of it, all of it, parts of it. So what do we do? What do we do? I have one particular question for you, drawing on your expertise in journalism and in broadcasting. It does seem to me that, I don't know whether I would say there's an opportunity or a responsibility or both, for some public awareness, some public, and I'm assuming the Grief Alliance hopes to do some of that.
Right.
But what is the role of media, for example, and broadcasting in this? Because it's a scary topic for many people, and yet there's no way to bring the community together other than kind of what we're doing and what many other groups are doing very well. But there are big gaps. How do we fill that? And what does the media have a role to play?
Well, for sure, the media has a role to play. I think that as advocates in this field or any other field, part of what we have to do is think about what engages the media and in what circumstances. The thing that we found, that I found at the beginning of the pandemic, was that there was a great openness by the media to talk about grief. Like, it was self-evident that grief was something that was going to come along with COVID. And by the way, it wasn't just people dying of COVID who were in these extraordinary situations, right? Like people who were dying of other things couldn't have funerals, couldn't have visits in the hospital, these kinds of things. What we found at that time was that there was a thirst, there was a hunger, there was a desire by the media um, to talk about this, and indeed also by parliamentary committees and things like that. And there was kind of a window where we were able to talk, and where I would say one of the things that struck me is because if we live, we grieve, right? Something that struck me was when I was on radio talk shows, and radio talk show hosts don't have a reputation for great sensitivity. Um, but almost everybody who interviewed me about this subject had some personal story, not necessarily arising from COVID, but it was a subject that connected with them, and they would share it. And it's very interesting that, but there's it's hard to sustain that in all circumstances. I was talking to the head of Grief Australia, and we don't have anything like it in Canada. But I mean, we should, and I hope one day we will. But Grief Australia is an organization that does training, it does research, it does and it also provides services, and particularly when they're like terrible events like the Humboldt crash or the murders in Nova Scotia or the wildfires or whatever, when there are these events. And what they told me is that it's when these terrible tragic events like the bushfires or the Bali bombings in the Australian context, that suddenly there's an interest, that governments suddenly go, oh, there's going to be a big component of grief here that we're going to have to, or that we should address. And because they have institutions there, they're able to step up, and as they did during COVID, and say, okay, well, here's some things we can do. Here's some ways we can approach it. So I think that as a community of people who are interested in these issues, we've got to keep up our daily work. We have to talk to policymakers, but we also have to seize opportunities when they arise. That there's a, in Ottawa, I think back to the terrible bus crash years ago. This is an opportunity to sort of, when the media are attuned to this issue, to step up and talk about it, and there is a willingness to talk. Can I just, I don't want to
Go ahead.
just run on, but there was something that you said earlier, really when we started, about like, why is grief so much in the ether, as it were. Part of it is COVID. I think COVID focused our minds on a whole bunch of things, and grief was one of them, and it kind of came to the surface. And so you see, Anderson Cooper has a podcast on grief, and is it Andrew Garfield who's gone around and been on Sesame Street talking about grief, and on talk shows and so on. So, but I think part of it has to do, you can go back and look at it in a different way. Over the last 30 or 40 years, we've had increasing consciousness of issues of mental health and mental illness, right? And there's, Bell Let's Talk, and there's been these campaigns, and I think we have, as a society, become somewhat more sensitized to issues of mental health and mental illness. But there's something peculiar about the way grief fits into that, which is that grief is not a mental illness. Grief is a normal response to profound loss. Like if you lost someone or something close to you and didn't feel grief, that would be something that would need to be examined, right? Like as a health issue, right? As a mental health issue. Grief is a normal, natural response to profound loss. It's the way that we um, metabolize that loss and try to reconfigure a life that's been shattered because an important part of it has disappeared, and we need to find some way of reconstituting ourselves in relation to the world. And grief is part of that. uh, and there are some people, as I said, who do develop what I think would, even in a technical sense, be called a mental illness. But most people go through this period of profound suffering and continue maybe to suffer for years later, but it's not a mental illness. And so the system doesn't have a way of dealing with that, right? Because like the health system's in charge of illness. It's not in charge of normal.
But let me just interrupt you on this point, because I think it's a very interesting one. Just yesterday, a colleague from another organization and I were on having a conversation on the phone. I think he's probably on this call right now. And we talked about the Bell initiative that you've just described, not in quite the same way that you have, Paul, but to say to each other, is there a way that those of us who are concerned about grief, so separating it entirely from the mental health issue, as you have with that understanding, is there a way that some sort of corporate support for the work of grief can be encouraged? For example, and you've referenced it, and we're aware of it at Compassionate Ottawa, just helping people know what to say, what not to say. You've talked about examples. So, is there a possibility? I'm not asking you to say yes or no, but I'm raising it with you because I think the Bell example has been very powerful in Canada. So I think it would be interesting whether that's a Grief Canada a la Grief Australia or not, I don't know. But I think it would be interesting to try and see if there is some opportunity for some significant corporate attention on making it easier for people, not making it easier to grieve, but making it easier for all of us to understand and to relate and so on. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't want to say too much about it, but I'm having lunch with somebody after this to talk about something along those lines.
Oh, darn, can I come? No, that's all
we
right.
We will. As we'll see how things develop, and we'll certainly be in touch. I think that the challenge is, and we've seen this in a number of areas, right? If you go back 30 or 40 years, like no corporation would want to be associated with cancer, right? Like we don't want and then and now I don't know, CIBC or whatever has a cancer run, and gradually the notion shifted about in terms of corporate involvement. I think that Bell was an example of a corporation that actually thought that it could improve its image by associating itself with mental health, as opposed to so I think there are grief, obviously, death, grief, palliative care, there's in a death denying society, there's obviously challenges to getting engagement from corporations about something that most of us don't want to think about, talk about. But I'm maybe there is an opportunity, and we'll see how that goes. Like, if it's reassuring to you, there are some of us who are thinking about that and trying to.
Good. Well, and there are some others of us who are thinking about it. So at some point, we'll bring our thinking together. What I'd really like to do in the last few minutes we have before we turn to Paula to see if there are any questions is to ask you, what advice do you have for Compassionate Ottawa? Our work is around workshops. it's not grief support in the way that some other organizations do. It's more about raising awareness, opportunities to talk about how you feel about grief, that kind of thing. Public education.
Right, right. So what I would say is, like, in the palliative care field generally, and this, we could go, like, I mean, even stepping back for a second, and we've alluded to this a couple of times, there are many people professionally engaged in this space, doctors, nurses, social workers, and so on, who have little or no training in grief, right? Who are encountering people every day who are in the depths of grief, but no one has ever given them any education about how to deal with them in that aspect, and so they ignore that aspect of the patient before them because they deal with the things that they know about. I think in the palliative care, like so much of palliative care and so much of caregiving, as as my wife's caregiver, so much of it is around the medical and the physical, right? And people need to be fed, they need to be clothed, they need to have their linens changed, they need to um, somebody needs to mow their lawn, and their bills need to be paid, and so there's so much logistical, medical, physical around supporting people in that circumstance that it's easy to be drawn into that and forget that the patient themselves is suffering from grief, from what more profound loss can there be than facing the loss of your own life, but that those people at the bedside, the people maybe downstairs, and maybe the kids downstairs, they are suffering from their and they are suffering from their grief. And what we really need to attend to in this space is not illness, but suffering. It's not just the ill who are suffering. And we need to expand our vision. And I think that's true of professionals, and it's true of volunteers. It's true of everybody who works in this space. And it's very, as I say, it's very easy to be drawn into just doing stuff and not connecting with people, and also focusing exclusively on the person who's ill or dying, and forgetting that somebody told me when Suzanne was ill, or somewhere I read somewhere about kind of this idea of their concentric circles, and the person in the middle, who's the person who's ill or dying, gets to lean out on any of the circles. Their immediate people are immediately around them, the friends circle around them, like the extended family, whatever. But also the people who are in the first circle, like the caregivers, the immediate family, they get to lean out and so on, right? Like, you don't lean in, you don't put pressures on the person who is dying, you don't put pressures on the family who are supporting, but we have to be creating a society in which people can lean out and get support from those expanding concentric circles.
I love that visual of leaning out. At Compassionate Ottawa and many other groups, we talk about the 95%. And
Right.
that is that very important care comes from healthcare providers for
Right,
people who are at the end of life.
Absolutely.
Serious illness. But 95%, and maybe it's not 95, maybe it's 90, but it's a large amount, come from the kind of groups that you've just described, Paul. And I love the notion of the concentric circles, and I love the notion of focusing on the suffering. So that's something that we're very interested in at Compassionate Ottawa. We're interested in figuring out how can that 95%, so many volunteer and community organizations like ours are focused on it one way or another, but we're actually not necessarily doing it together. We're not figuring
Right,
this,
right,
the map of the
right,
community out together. And
right,
that's something that we're quite interested in at Compassionate Ottawa. How can we figure out how to make sure that those circles are in place and that they're moving
right,
outward? And
right.
I thank you for that. That's great advice for us. Let me turn to you, Paula. You're not on the screen at the moment, but we want to be sure that if there are questions from participants that you can address them to Paul or me, but mostly Paul, I think.
Sure. So firstly, I just want to thank both of you for your conversation. It's been very enriching, and we have had echoes of thanks throughout the comment box and the Q&A. Just thank you, Paul, for sharing your personal story and for bringing this conversation to us today. The first question that we have is specifically from someone who describes that they're a retired superintendent of curriculum from a school board and wonders how can organizations partner with school boards to support students better?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the in our consultations with people who are professionally engaged with grief around the country, we hear again and again that we need education. We need more in the schools. Children need to grow up understanding more about death and more about grief, and that you need to, if you're going to have a social change in attitudes towards death and grief, then it has to begin there, or it should begin there. And then we hear something else, which is, well, I tried to get into my local school or my local school board, and you couldn't knock down those doors. You couldn't find somebody. Um, Schools have so many jobs. They are expected to do so much on top of teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. They are also expected to do all kinds of social and civic education. And the attitude of many educators, whether they're like principals or teachers, is, I can't take on another thing. When I talked to Grief Australia about this, they said, you know what? It doesn't work by just going holus bolus and trying to get every school and every school board and so on. What the way it works is that when a particular school has had a tragedy, when a particular guidance counselor has had a significant event that they've had to deal with, that those people become open to it because they're going, I have to deal with it and I'm not equipped to deal with it. And when you give them support, then they become missionaries within their own sphere. That it's not at the beginning, we need to identify people who are open to hear that message, who actually think it's going to help them get through their day, as opposed to putting another obstacle in their way to getting through the day. And once they've heard from us and maybe got support, got training, figured out that this is helping them in the tasks, that they will then they become the sort of the points of light that spread the message elsewhere. So I think we've got to be strategic in the way we interact with the schools. And I'm looking at this from a 30,000 foot level. I'm just reflecting what people have told me, and I haven't tried to knock on those doors or operationalize this concept. But I think it's a little bit parallel to what I was saying about the media. You need to speak to people when they're open to be spoken to, and not try to ram it at them when they've got other things on their mind.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then the next question that we have asks, what can we as individuals do to support the Alliance's work and advocate for improved grief services?
So well, thank you very much. We could go, please, we will put the link to the Canadian Grief Alliance in the show notes, and what I would say is that we are, like, we would like you to subscribe to our newsletters, to like link into what we're doing. We're about to launch this website. We don't, to be honest, do as good a job as we should to engage our supporters. We have 170 organizations, like including the Canadian Medical Association, the Nurses Association, Psychiatrists Association, who are part of our alliance. But we, among the many tasks we're funded for from Health Canada, sort of engagement with our members is not one of them. And so to be honest, I think we struggle a little bit, but we are putting a focus on that. We're trying to get better. We want you on our distribution list, and we're going to try. We started to build structures to engage people more, and I hope that out of this period of research and gestation that we've been on the last couple of years, that we are going to move into a more campaigning element. So stay tuned, I hope, and please link up with us and get on our list. And I hope that you can help us do what we all want to do here.
And then just to reiterate what Paul has just said, we will send an email out to everyone that's been on this call today that will have a link, a bunch of resources in it, and one will be how you can connect with the Canadian Grief Alliance. And then the next question that we have for you, Paul, says, after death, there's lots of paperwork and affairs to take care of. Also, the settling of the estate too often causes rifts in relationships and families. In your survey, were there any questions or information that highlighted the impact of such chores?
I don't want to, like, we didn't ask a question specifically on that. We for sure hear that 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 for some people, those differences over estates, like who gets what and how much and all those sorts of things, can definitely aggravate the experience of grief or complicate the experience of grief. I know that in my own case, my God, the pile of paperwork seemed like it seemed like an enormous burden at a time when you don't where you don't have much energy. And I'm not a paperwork guy particularly. I think some people actually find it soothing to work their way through that stuff. I totally did not, and I found it difficult. And I just like on a personal note, the funeral home that we dealt with offered some sort of a service to meet with somebody. And I kept putting it off because I thought it was like another imposition on my time. And when I finally got around and met with the guy a couple of months later, he had all the forms from, you know, the insurance, the Elections Canada. You're supposed to notify Elections Canada. They're supposed to notify the vital statistics. He had every form that you could possibly, and I just had to sit there and sign these things. And I thought, oh my God, I wish I had met with you earlier. But there is a burden of paperwork. You know, we're lucky in this country compared with the United States, because there are people who are financially immiserated by illness in this country, but it's not like it's in the United States where but there are, you know, people lose a breadwinner, you know, like there are not everybody's amply insured. Like there are a whole bunch of practical issues which include income that you know, people may have lost time to work because they've been a caregiver, and that may have affected their financial situation. So as we talk about grief in terms of sort of an emotional and psychological experience, we also have to attend to the fact that people are facing logistical, financial, other practical concerns, which may preoccupy them as much as their own internal state of being, I guess.
And then we've had a couple of comments and questions that are looking at the way that funeral rituals and rituals around end of life have changed over the past couple of decades. And specifically, we have one question that asks, is it ever too late to send a note of condolence?
I don't think it is. I don't think it is. I think, like, in the case of in Suzanne's case, because she was a foreign service officer, a diplomat, many people who were friends were away at posting, and like didn't like, so some people would, I got emails like 2 years later saying, "Oh my gosh, I just had lunch with somebody and they said that Suzanne had died and I had no idea, and I'm sorry about that." And I think that, something that people, one of the things that we heard in our survey is that uh, people, we have a tendency to think that there's some sort of statute of limitations on grief, so that, after someone's been on their like 1 week bereavement leave, or perhaps some people think like after a year, that they're no longer grieving, and that's not the case. And so if you would express condolences and connection with somebody a week after, express it 2 weeks after, or 2 months after, or 2 years after, because that person is still grieving. And if it would be meaningful in the first week or two to say, I understand your loss, because the person you lost meant something to me. If that would be meaningful in the early days, it's going to be meaningful a year or two later. I don't think there's a statute of limitations. And people who are grieving say that's one of the biggest misconceptions. Is part of what happens is that some people are quite visibly shattered by the experience of grief. And then when they pull themselves back together so that they can operate in the world, people think, oh, they're okay. The fact that somebody seems to be composed and is back at work and so doesn't mean they're not still grieving. It just means that they've found the will and the strength to get back to presenting themselves to the world the way they used to. It doesn't mean that inside the grief is over. In fact, that's rarely the case.
Thank you. And then it looks like those are all of the questions that we have, but I just wanted to read out a couple of comments that came up in the chat box for anyone that wasn't keeping an eye on that during the conversation. We had a couple of comments that were talking about wind phones, that there are 2 in the area, one in Ottawa at the Regional Cancer Foundation and one at the Dundas County Hospice in Williamsburg. And what that is, for anyone that doesn't know, a wind phone is a phone booth or a structure with a disconnected phone in it, which people use to call loved ones who have passed away, speaking their thoughts, feelings, or messages into the wind as a way to process grief and find comfort. So that was mentioned a couple of times in our chat box. We also had some comments from an individual saying that Bereaved Families of Ottawa offers peer support programs, and that the Ottawa Pastoral Care Training Program covers grief in their 10-week training program. And finally, on the question that was about the paperwork related to end of life, we had someone who said that there are aftercare specialists that will help with the paperwork for no extra cost. Most funeral directors will also guide you through every detail as well. And then we had some personal stories that were shared with us, as well as people were really echoing what they were hearing. And we did get one note that people were nodding along as well with what they were hearing, though you could not see them. So with that, pardon me, go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, can I just make a couple of points on that? First of all, on the wind phones thing, and we're developing our website, as I say. I know I'm not involved in the day-to-day management of that project, but we were talking at some point of looking at some kind of virtual wind phone thing, some sort of feature on the website that would allow people to send a note or whatever. And I would, I'm struggling a little bit because this, my about 6 or 8 months after my wife died, I thought, well, I've got to shut down my wife's Google account or Gmail account, right? And because like you keep, you're getting crap on it and so on. And anyway, it just seemed like some kind of something I had to do. I went on to shut it down, and when I went in, I found that my daughter was sending Suzanne emails,
Oh,
which is very similar to the Win phone, right?
no.
One other thing I wanted, because it came, I wanted to say, which also involves my daughter, that I think we talked about this a little bit in preparing for this, but then it sort of never came up in the conversation. Which is, how do you talk to kids about illness when somebody is dying? Like, how do you have those conversations with young people? It took us a while to figure out our own protocol with that, like as it would for anybody, like when do you tell kids and what do you tell kids and so on. And one of the things that like we developed after a while was a kind of rule, which was you tell them what you know, not what you fear. Like that they need to be, that they have a right to be acquainted with the facts as they are as they're going along. But you find in your own experience when you're going through a life-limiting illness that there are a lot of fears, and some of those are justified fears. I'm not trying to dismiss them, but that sharing your fear with your children is not a great look or a great help to them, but them feeling secure that you're being honest with them so that they're not having to listen at the door wondering what it is that you're keeping from them. That's to me, that was an important principle. But I'll tell you something about that. I mentioned that my son sort of was falling apart in the last like 6 months of Suzanne's life. At some point, Suzanne said to me, how come Sophia doesn't seem to be affected by this? Like, she's going along in her little like 13, 14-year-old life and doesn't seem to be um and I think that Suzanne was almost hurt by it. Well, I think she was hurt by that. She wondered, and I said, maybe we've done too good a job of not sharing our fears. Maybe she doesn't understand where we are, and maybe we need to, this is a point where the end is in sight. We can, maybe we should be sharing that. And we sat down and talked with her, and she was just 14 or 13 at the time, and that changed her mentalities. In the last like few months of Suzanne's life, Sophia became very attentive. She became very engaged. I would say that her grief, unlike my son's, which was heavily anticipatory, came much more after the death. And that's another example about how we each grieve differently, right? But anyway, I just wanted to share that experience. I don't know if it's helpful to anyone, but it's certainly that kind of what we know, not what we fear, was helpful to us up to the point, and then we had to readjust.
Okay, well, Paul, I think we have come to the end. Paula, am I right about that? Is there anything else you wanted to say or tell us?
No, that's it, Monica. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, Paul, I can't thank you enough. This has been a very, very rich conversation, and I'm very grateful to you. You've told us your story thoughtfully and with vulnerability, and that is how we all are. And I can't tell you how I appreciate you taking the time. And we will keep in touch about a number of things. I look forward to that. And Compassionate Ottawa may turn to you for some continuing advice, and that would be terrific. So thank you so very much. And to all of you who have joined the call, thank you. Your participation has been terrific, and Paula has already told you about what happens next. You can go to our website to learn more about our grief program, compassionateottawa.ca, and perhaps think about a workshop. And there are some grief resources on the website. So you'll be able to find that, I think, quite easily. And if you care to, you could send a donation to Compassionate Ottawa. We are very grateful for the generosity of so many people, and we would encourage you to go to Canada Helps and find us and send us a contribution so that we can continue to do this really important community work. And on that note, I think we'll sign off. And again, Paul, warmest thanks to you and all the best.
Thanks so much. And thanks for everybody who tuned in.